Welcome back to Beyond Your Balance Sheet from the Sedora Group of Steward Partners Global Advisory. I'm Laura Canoy. Beyond Your Balance Sheet is a conversation series which examines the intersection of financial health with overall well-being. The Sedora Group sponsors this program as part of its larger goal to help clients achieve fulfilling lives, professionally and personally. And that's where our guest today comes in. James McKim is a coach, facilitator, speaker, entrepreneur, also author of the book, The Diversity Factor, Igniting Superior Organizational Performance. McKim says all the research shows when leaders of organizations commit to diversity, equity, and inclusion, they see a financial payoff, increased market share, greater productivity, more innovation. But the benefits go deeper than mere dollar figures. McKim says these organizations also see happier and more satisfied employees. James McKim is with us now on the program. And James, it is great to have you on Beyond Your Balance Sheet. Welcome.
Oh, thank you, Laura. It's great to be here with you.
Well, I've been to a couple of your presentations, James, and I've heard you talk about the paradox of diversity. So in terms of both the individual and the organization, what is the paradox of diversity?
Well, such a great question. So the paradox of diversity is the notion that we see ourselves as individuals as being unique, not like anyone else, which is true. Yet at the same time, we see ourselves as just like everybody else. We all breathe the same air. Our blood is red. We have 99% of the same DNA genes and chromosomes. So as individuals, we go through the world with this paradox. We're an individual, yet we're like everybody else. And so organizations have to deal with that, deal with the fact that individuals see themselves as unique, yet still see themselves as being just like everybody else. So that's that paradox of diversity. And sometimes it's referred to as the paradox of difference, but it's the same notion that we go through life struggling with this contradiction.
Why is that such an important concept to start out this conversation today and all the conversations that you lead, James?
Well, I think it's such an important concept to lead with because we have to recognize what perspective we're taking when we have these discussions about very important topics like life, like who gets what resources, like who gets what way. And so if we are in the mode of, well, I'm an individual and I'm unique, then I see the world through those glasses at that point, and I want to act, and I want everyone to act as if everyone is unique. But if I see the world through the lens of, if I'm thinking about, well, I'm just like everybody else, then that leads to, well, everyone should be treated the same way. And we know that everyone being treated the same way is not exactly what's going to help everyone to achieve what they want to achieve and get what they need out of life. So understanding those paradoxes and which perspective you're thinking about at any particular time shapes the conversations that we have.
And that gets to what you've talked about, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm going to ask you about that in a minute, James. But first, I'm really curious, what kinds of groups or companies do you work with on these issues? Because from my understanding, you work with a wide array of organizations.
I do. I work with for-profit organizations like Fidelity and Vanguard. I work with nonprofit organizations like hospitals. I work with the New Hampshire Center for Nonprofits, for example. I work with religious organizations. I'm a member of the Episcopal Church, and I serve as chair of the Executive Council Committee on Anti-Racism and Racial Reconciliation. I work with schools, school districts. I work closely with Manchester School District and Tina Philibot, who's the Chief Diversity Officer there, and other school districts across New England. So I work with a very wide range of organizations, and both large and small, and they have different characteristics when it comes to thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, depending upon the size of your organization as well.
What do they all have in common? Those are very different types of organizations, churches, businesses, nonprofits, schools. But what's the sort of uniting factor that makes them come to you, James, and say, help?
Well, the uniting factor is that they're all struggling to make sure that, one, their employees are as productive as possible. And we know that people are as productive as possible when they feel like they belong, when they're happy, when they're engaged. So from that perspective, they're coming to me for help. How do we do that? How do we create the culture where everyone feels like they can bring their authentic selves to the work and be as productive as possible? And also bring the many different perspectives that go into creating innovation, go into creating ideas that will propel the organization forward. And then from a customer or client perspective, there's this recognition that our demographics are changing. And here in New Hampshire, we know that the 2010 census had us as a 91% white state. The 2020 census has that shifting to a roughly 87% white state. So that's just the racial demographics that are changing. Age demographics are changing. So organizations are coming to me and asking, so how do we deal with this change in the demographic trends? How do we prepare ourselves when we've been traditionally focusing on white males in the middle age range as our customer base? Because they're recognizing that they need to broaden their customer base and client base if they're going to succeed in the long term.
Right. So whether they're a church hoping to attract new members, or a business hoping to attract more customers, or schools just trying to provide the best education possible, they're coming to you, James, and they're saying, we need to figure this out.
That's right. And I'm not alone doing this work. And we need as many people doing this work as possible, because I obviously can't be everywhere.
Yeah.
But they're coming to me, and they're coming to other organizations who are doing this kind of work as well.
So before we dive a little deeper, let's just get a couple really important definitions out of the way. What is diversity, James? Because I've heard you say that this is often too narrowly defined, too simply defined.
Yeah. So when people use the term diversity, what they're usually thinking about is race or maybe gender. And I really love the definition that Marilyn Loden came up with in 1991 when she created the model that she called the diversity wheel. And the diversity wheel that she created has at the center of it personality. And she said that we are all comprised of, we all have different personality characteristics. So we have characteristics like our age, like our race, like our ethnicity, like our gender. Right? And those characteristics make us to the core who we are. Right? And those don't change really over our lifetimes. She called those internal characteristics, or primary characteristics. Then she said there are these secondary characteristics that are how we interact with the rest of the world. So where are we physically in the world? Where are we geographically in the world? What are our habits? What's our religion? What's our work experience? How do we appear to others? So the secondary characteristics around how we interact with the rest of the world also make up our personalities. And then, and this is an evolution of her original model, was created by Lee Garden-Swartz and Chris Rao in 2007. And they added this dimension of how we interact in organizations. So organizations and institutions. So what function do we perform in that institution or organization? Are we part of marketing? Are we part of sales? Are we in a church context? Are we a parishioner? Are we clergy? Are we a manager or an individual contributor in that organization?
So all kinds of diversity,
all
not
kinds
just
of
racial and gender.
characteristics,
Yeah.
right? So diversity is about those different characteristics. And we want to have as many of those characteristics as possible in our organizations, because that gives us the different perspectives that lead to innovation, that lead to a richness of life.
Yeah, market share, if you want to put pure dollar figures on it, as you've said, but also happier Employees, happier members, happier customers.
Exactly.
One more definition to get out of the way, though, and I've heard you talk
Sure.
about this too. What's the difference, James, and why is this so important between equity and equality?
We so conflate those two terms of equity and equality. And I think everyone can agree that we want to have equal opportunity, equal access. But the challenge is that to do that, we think, well, that means we can treat everybody equally. And there's where the rub comes, because if we treat everyone equally, and going back to that paradox of diversity, everyone's an individual, that means we're not the same, right? So that means what might help you may not help me. And in the case of when we talk about racial diversity in different races, we know there are situations that have created a society where people of color are disadvantaged. So giving the same assistance to a person of color that you might give to a white person might not get that person of color to the place where they need to be. And so that's the difference between equality and equity. Equity is giving somebody, treating someone the way that they need to be treated to succeed, rather than assuming that the way you treat one person is the same way that you should treat another person.
So that's a much deeper and broader definition. I mean, an obvious example would be, a set of 5 stairs saying to someone who has mobility issues, well, it works for me. I can get up these stairs.
Exactly the right analogy. Yeah.
So a key focus of this program, James, Beyond Your Balance Sheet, really is exploring how people feel about their lives beyond their balance sheet, beyond their finances, in their relationships, both those at home for sure, and out in our communities, but also those critical workplace relationships. It's about their own physical and mental health. So in that vein, James, you write that a commitment to DEI, meaning diversity, equity, and inclusion, means more satisfied people, whether we're talking about a company or a church or a nonprofit. So walk us through that process of ultimately how commitment to DEI creates happier people, because on the surface, some people might think, oh, it's too hard to work with people who think differently than me, who have such vastly different life experiences than me. Do you know what I'm trying to say there?
Yeah, so there are kind of two questions wrapped up into there. One is, how do we do it? How do we live into diversity, equity, and inclusion? And then, what does it look like? Right? What's the result kind of look like? And I'd say,
so how do you get there? Yeah, go ahead.
And how do you get there? So it starts for me with this notion that everyone wants to belong. Like everybody wants to belong. And so how do we create an environment where everyone can belong? Well, we need to treat people in a way, we just talked about treating people equitably. For organizations, that means leaders need to be committed to taking the time it takes to get to know someone as an individual and what their needs are. And there are techniques that can be used, and we teach these techniques to leaders. In fact, there's a great book from Jennifer Brown called How to Be an Inclusive Leader that goes into how to be really sensitive to people as individuals, asking questions, getting to know them. So an organization needs to make the commitment to having leaders who are going to be inclusive, who are going to learn how to get to know their people and know what makes them tick, know what motivates them, know what gifts they have, what skills, what knowledge they have, and how that gets used in the context of making the organization do the things it needs to do.
I can already see the productivity benefits from what you talked about, and I can see the individual satisfaction benefits from what you talked about.
Absolutely, because when we feel like we're included, when we feel like we belong, we're going to produce, right? We want to do a good job for someone we think, and for an organization we think cares about us. And in fact, when we talk about belonging, C.E. Garcia, in a paper she wrote, identified 5 characteristics of belonging, which I suggested organizations think about. Are we tracking to these 5? Do I feel like I'm valued and cared for? Do I have a role or responsibility? Is my background or ethnicity or culture valued? Are there people around the organization and the group who look like me? And finally, do I feel like I can contribute? So if you measure as an organization whether people in the organization how they feel about those five, and there's a physical wellness component and an emotional wellness component, that's when you know you've got a culture where people feel like they belong and they're going to produce.
And that's a lot more for an organization to work on than just hiring, a couple people from a different ethnic minority, sort of having racial diversity. You said that's way too easy. It goes a lot further than that.
It does. And one of the things that I say in the book and I talk about is that diversity without equity and inclusion is actually worse than no diversity at all.
Wow, really?
Yes, yes.
Why is that, James?
And that's because if you think about it, if you've got diverse people in your organization, but you don't think about how they interact and how you interact with them, then you have potentially language differences. You have differences in values, differences in styles of working. So if you don't engage those and name that there are differences, you get conflict between the people in the organization, or even in institutions too, not just in organizations, for-profit or nonprofit, but that happens in the church as well, right? In schools as well, in communities.
And then they're coming to you and saying, help.
And they're coming and saying, help, we have people who are complaining, people who have said things. I was just on a call with someone this morning who had an employee who said something that offended most of the employees, and they had to let that person go. And they want to know, how do I prevent that from happening? Mm-hmm. Right? Because that's taking time that we now have to take to address the situation instead of getting the real work done.
Right. And it creates bad feelings, and that's not what we want.
Right.
When did you start doing this work, James? You've had lots of careers. You've been an entrepreneur ever since I've known you. When did you start focusing in on this issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion and helping organizations with it?
So this started a bit back in 2010 when I agreed, when Bishop Gene Robinson asked me to take on chairing the Episcopal Diocese of New Hampshire's Anti-Racism Committee. And when the bishop asks you to do something, you kind of have to say yes.
Right.
So that was focused in the church world. It wasn't really until I left Hewlett Packard Enterprise in 2018 and went on my own to do consulting, and 2019, and then the murders of George Floyd happened, and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. And I started seeing this need to, from an organizational perspective, look at how we become better at interacting across difference. So that's when I started really doing research and started writing the book. And that's how I fell into that. So kind of a merger of my experience in the business world, where I've been for 30 years, and my personal life with the Episcopal Church and doing work around racial reconciliation. And just recognizing that racism and sexism and ageism are all isms, they're all symptoms of a root problem. And that root problem is we don't treat people like individuals with value. We see them and we make assumptions about them, we're biased, and the world has created our biases in the ways that we tend not to look at and try to get to know the person before we make a judgment about who they are and how they might behave. And I said, that's got to stop, because that's not productive for organizations. And that's the message I want to try to bring.
Wow. Well, over those years, especially since 2018, 2019, when you went off on your own, how have you seen your work changing over that time? Is there more than ever? Is there a different subset of issues that are coming to the table? I'm just wondering how it's changed over the last couple of years that you've been doing it.
I think it's changed in that more organizations are now recognizing that they need to do the work and are committing to do the work. Whereas before it was just, oh, we've had these horrific events with George Floyd's murder, and we know we need to do something, but we're not sure we could commit to do it. So now I'm seeing more and more organizations being committed to do it and being willing to spend the time to do it. And it does take some time.
It's not something they can just jump into right away. So initially, were organizations saying, come give us a hand and we hope to be done in 2 weeks?
Yes, yes. And there's still some organizations who think, well, we'll just, and the Episcopal Church, we've been dealing with this issue for a long time. We've had a canon in the Episcopal Church that says every clergy going through the ordination process must take anti-racism training. The challenge with that was we never defined what that meant. We never defined what we wanted people to know and be able to do. So there is this check the box mentality that we saw in the Episcopal Church and we see in other organizations, because this is not something people have had to deal with before. So they think, well, there must be a quick fix to this. Training is a quick fix. And training is usually a quick fix to everything, although it's really not the total fix. So what we're seeing is that people are recognizing that you can't just do an hour worth of training anymore and that solves the problem. There's got to be more to it. It's a culture shift.
In terms of, again, the idea that we're trying to look at not just our financial wellness, but our overall wellness, our overall just feeling good about our own place in the world. What's your message, James, to people about the role of diversity, equity, and inclusion in their own happiness?
So my message here, and this is, when I first started writing a book, I was actually going to write about the benefits of diversity for an individual. And that morphed into benefits for an organization, and that's the title. But I think about things from the perspective of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which talks about, at the very bottom level, survival, the breathing air, eating food, our sustenance for our bodies, and it works all the way up to the the level of self-actualization, where we've become all that we can be. And along the way, I realized, well, everything on those levels, except for the air we breathe, and actually to some extent even that, we don't create ourselves. We have to get from someone else, or someone else has to protect that, like the air, right? Mother Nature provides the air, but we as humans have to protect it, because in many places we're destroying the air even that we're trying to breathe. So the benefit of diversity and people and all its forms of nature is that we get to live, and we get to live securely. We get to live rich lives, experience multiple things. We don't have to experience the same thing, talking to the same people over and over again. We can talk to many different people and experience many different cultures, many different foods, many different forms of art. That's what makes life rich.
Right, because who wants to eat peanut butter and jelly every single day?
Who wants PB&J? Well, if you're in the United States, you don't want
as good as it is. Yeah. James, it's always just great to talk to you. So much to think about. Thank you very much for being with me today.
Oh, thank you, Laura. It's been great to be with you again.
That's James McKim. He's a coach, facilitator, speaker, entrepreneur, and author of the book, The Diversity Factor, Igniting Superior Organizational Performance. James is also the head of the Manchester, New Hampshire NAACP. Beyond Your Balance Sheet is sponsored by the Sedora Group of Stewart Partners Global Advisory. And I'm Laura Kanoy. Thanks, everyone, for being with us.